A warm welcome to the Fireside Chat on SME Innovation and Technology Cooperation. I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of the organizers of this event, which is the German Center for Research and Innovation, which I'm heading, and the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft. My colleague Anandi Iyer is with us, who will take over the moderation. Hi, Anandi, welcome to see you. Let me set a bit the frame for this event which we are running today. We all know that small and medium-sized enterprises are a key factor for economic development, and that holds true as well as for India and Germany, and the numbers are impressive. And they are also a driver for innovation and research, but we also know that very often the collaboration between these small and medium-sized enterprises and academia has space, there is space for development, especially in the international field. So as internationalization is important for research and innovation, is also technology development over borders. And that's why we picked up the topic, the two institutions, the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft and the German Center for Research and Innovation, to develop a short or a small project on this. We are joint hands for a cooperative project where we try to figure out how to enhance the international innovation and technology cooperation, focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises. And this Fireside Chat today is part of the project we are currently running. You might wonder why the German Center for Research and Innovation is into this field. So we are connecting the German and Indian research and innovation ecosystems. We are looking at different levels, and industry research, startups, SME, but also larger industry complex are, of course, belonging to us as long as we're dealing with research and innovation. And that's why we boarded on this project. We try to, with the project, aim to explore the current status of international cooperation between SMEs and academia, to learn more about barriers and opportunities, but also the needed support and measures for internationalization. I'm looking forward to an interactive discussion today to learn from the speakers, but also, of course, from the audience who is with us today, and a warm welcome to all who are joining us. Today's Fireside Chat is moderated by my colleague Anandi Iyer, who leads the office of the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft in India, with whom we are jointly running the activity. She is the director and head of the Fraunhofer Society's India office, and she has been working in the field of collaborative technology and innovation in the Indo-European corridor for the last more than 20 years. And she has many leadership roles and was special advisor to Germany's Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And what the role of Fraunhofer is in this field, she might better explain than I can. So she's active in diverse bodies and agencies. She has been a main person behind driving also to foster the engagement of women in technology, science and research. There is the WISER program of the FICCI, where she has been really engaged. So I'm very glad, Anandi, that you are with us today. So thanks for taking up the moderation, and now over to you to Bangalore.
Thank you so much, Katya. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the two illustrious speakers that we have today, Rainer Frietsch and Professor Rishikesha Krishnan. It's indeed a huge pleasure to have you with us. As Katya pointed out to you, the current topic that we have today for this Fireside Chat is really how to look at getting the small and medium industry, which in any economy is considered the backbone and the engine of economic growth, to come together in a collaborative mode and work together to scale, to globalize and move up the value chain. Many programs have been initiated, not only in the Indo-German corridor, but also in various parts of the globe. And while these programs were largely short-term measures or intermediate measures, the imminent need right now is for a sustained platform and a focused initiative that strengthens the SME to SME collaboration, particularly with the idea of technology development and research, and draw a long-term strategic program which can support and forge technology collaborations and strategic alliances. It is with this idea that the DWIH and Fraunhofer, which is one of the world leaders in technology and innovation, came together. And while we have conducted stakeholder workshops in India and Germany, where we brought in experts from various domains, be it government, research, industry, multilateral companies, as well as multipliers from the industry associations, we felt that in order to give this entire discussion a very clear format and to firmly focus on what should be the discussion going forward and what are the programs that we can develop, we thought it would be a great idea to bring two experts, two very well-known experts from Germany and India, to clearly set the focus and attention on the SME to SME collaborations, share their insights and experiences, and also suggestions on how we can leverage the strengths of this industry segment. I'd just like to briefly introduce our two-star speakers today, starting with Rainer Frietsch, who's the head of the Competence Center, Innovation and Knowledge Economy of the Fraunhofer ISI in Karlsruhe. He finished a business training in wholesale export and import trade, and after this, he studied social science at the University of Mannheim. He holds a PhD in economics from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And since 2000, he's employed at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe. He has written many papers and research papers, as well as produced recently an excellent document on the impact of Fraunhofer, which I'm sure he'll be happy to share with you, the impact of a research organization like Fraunhofer on the economy. His work focuses on patent statistics, bibliometrics, economic and social indicators, qualification and education in the innovation process, methodological foundations of empirical research, knowledge and technology transfer, and particularly science and industry collaboration. Welcome, Rainer. It's a pleasure to have you on board. My other speaker, of course, equally renowned, very well known in India and abroad, Professor Rishikesha Krishnan, is Director and Professor of Strategy at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He held the Jamuna Raghavan Chair in Entrepreneurship at IIMB from 2007 to 2010 and completed a 5-year term as the Director of Indian Institute of Management at Indore. He was educated at the prestigious IIT Kanpur, Stanford University, and IIM Ahmedabad. His main areas of interest are strategy and innovation. And of course, as many of us know, he has been listed in the Thinkers 50 India list of most influential management thinkers from India. And of course, he has many publications to his credit, as well as being a member of expert committees set up by the government of India, and also co-founded a startup and a CEO of another, been jury of Economic Times Startup Awards, and currently on the advisory board of Your Nest Investment Advisors. So needless to say, we have two of the best speakers we can get for the evening. So without much ado, let me welcome my two speakers and get straight to our discussion. Let's start at the very beginning. When we talk of collaboration, we usually speak of equals coming together. In this case, what is the structure of SME in Germany and India? Are there similarities despite the very obvious differences in size and the qualification criteria of being an SME? I'd like to throw the question first to Rishi. Rishi, where do you see chances or similarities for the two types of organizations or even companies to come together?
Thank you, Anandi. Good afternoon to all the people who are attending this seminar. I think there are several opportunities for collaboration. Let me just focus on one or two to just set the ball rolling. I think one area where Indian SMEs are increasingly strong is in digital technology and IT. These may not be the SMEs that we traditionally think of in the manufacturing sector, but these are very technically competent small enterprises, often driven by very highly qualified technical people. India, as I think we all know, has been a leader in several aspects of IT for close to 3 to 4 decades now. And as a result, there are a lot of these small companies with very specialized IT and tech capabilities. I see a complementarity between these companies and the companies in Germany, which have a very strong traditional expertise in engineering, product design, manufacturing technology. Many of the industries are now going through the digital revolution, and I see this as one pretty natural area for collaboration between Indian and German small enterprises. The other point I would like to make at this stage of the discussion is there's another way in which Indian and German companies could complement each other. I think Indian companies are quite fast, they're quite flexible. If you want to manage in the Indian environment, you need to be able to manage complexity. Regulatory frameworks in India change very rapidly. We have a lot of diversity in the Indian social environment. So Indian companies are used to managing in a much more complex environment than would typically be experienced by a company in Germany. On the other hand, German companies are renowned for their discipline, their deep engineering expertise, their technological capabilities. I think when these two come together, there would again be some very interesting complementarity of skills. In fact, I was just taking many of these points from a very interesting case study that I read about an Indian company, Bharat Forge. Bharat Forge, of course, today is not a small company, but it started as a small company 35, 40 years ago. And about 15, 20 years ago, they made several acquisitions in Germany. And what I mentioned just now are some of the complementary skills that Bharat Forge saw coming from the acquired companies in Germany. So I don't see why we can't see similar complementarities between Indian and German small enterprises as well. Let me stop here right now.
Yeah, thank you. I find that very interesting that, the similarities are so glaring and obvious, but there must be other challenges why it didn't happen. We'll take it in the course of this discussion going forward. But going to you, Rainer, you recently did a lot of studies around, SMEs, their characterization, their technology capabilities. Would you like to share some of your thoughts on where we position ourselves in both these countries with regard to SMEs?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I would indeed share a few of my thoughts concerning this structure, which I think is really important to understand also how German SMEs, and we call it Mittelstand, which is a little bit a broader definition. Several of them are, the owners are the main drivers of the development, also of the decision making. And not so many are really registered at the capital market. So there are a particular kind of type of animal, I would say. And even within that, there are different species which we can find. So we have very small but globalized companies which are really world leaders. They are maybe active in niche markets and they have their success stories. I would maybe not so much talk about these today. Then we have a large number, so 99.5% of all the companies in Germany are essentially SMEs, but not all of them are doing R&D and not all of them are into technology. So when we think of, let's say, the group that is really relevant here, we're talking about 30 to 40,000 companies, I would say, that usually are innovators or innovation-oriented companies. But still several of them are of course SMEs. However, they are even within that we can find additional differences. So not all of them are into manufacturing, but of course this is the backbone of German industry in that respect. So several are coming out of that. But I perfectly agree with Professor Krishnan on the fact that there is a big potential in digitalization and IT, the competences in India. When I compare the profiles of both in scientific and maybe also in technological, let's say, competences or specialization, there is indeed this complementarity. So German industry is about to be digitalized, and especially the ones on R&D and focusing on R&D and on production. So manufacturing is indeed, let's say, a core group for potential collaboration. However, companies, not all of them are really internationally oriented. So because they are part of value chains of larger companies and then indirectly internationalized. And what we see, and this is then my last sentence here, in the last years is that the share of innovators among the SMEs has has decreased over time. In the last 2-3 years, it seems to increase again, but it really decreased over time. So R&D has become more expensive, more complex, and it's maybe now done a little bit differently. And from my point of view, this is another chance. It's a challenge, but at the same time, it's a chance for a collaboration, because when these companies don't do their own R&D, they still need to rely on R&D. And R&D is not only really hardware technology R&D, but it's also what is behind processes that change and where they have to innovate. So definitely I see a potential for collaboration here.
Yeah, thank you, Rainer. I think a lot of these aspects that you mentioned, that, the hidden champions, which is the Mittelstand in Germany, and the fact that there are niche companies which could be world leaders, and they also want to kind of globalize, is very well known. But we have often found, and when I've worked on trying to get SMEs to collaborate with India, there are some very structural deficit that seems to present itself as a challenge. One of them is that the SMEs in Germany are, in terms of numbers, number of employees, are very few. So they find it extremely difficult to come again and again to India and send their employees to, set up the collaboration. This is one challenge which we have seen. But are there other challenges that we are not completely aware of, or which you think are extremely important? I would like you to start with that, and then maybe Rishi can also say, from the Indian perspective, where do the Indian SMEs see a structural problem or even a mindset problem in collaborating with similar SMEs from Germany? Rainer, would you like to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, for any collaboration, but for an international in particular, trust is the basis, and the trust comes from experience, comes from exchange, and maybe is also something which need to be developed step by step. So, indeed, if there is no opportunity, then there will be never any experience to be developed. And therefore, what we're discussing here, and also the program that Katja Lasch presented, is of course part of exactly that, providing opportunities for this building up of trust. And for SMEs, it's maybe a little bit more complex, even at least for German SMEs. Several of them, even when they're into technology productions also, so if they're innovators, they hardly use IPR in a strict sense. So they don't use so often patents because they're reluctant in using, or they prefer to keep things secret. So secrecy is their main protection approach. And having tacit knowledge that they then that makes their competitive edge at the end. So, and this is a crucial thing from my point of view when you think of building trust on the one hand, and on the other hand also when you have to let's say assess their motivations and maybe the challenges they face for themselves, or how they define them, that they are really reluctant in that respect. I think it's therefore necessary also to further explain and elaborate on the advantages of the collaboration and on the changes that are going on. So, for example, the IPR system in India is definitely increasing, and things like that. So I think this kind of information is definitely necessary to keep this or to overcome this reluctance at the German SME side, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the second thing that's extremely important in this whole gamut, and that is the information exchange and availability of information. Rishi, do you see this as a problem, or one of the reasons why companies don't come together in a technology collaboration, because the information on what is available and where to find partners is not easily accessible?
I think if you want to understand the challenges faced by Indian SMEs in technological collaboration, you probably need to go back a little bit in time and understand the historical context. So if you look at the whole expansion of the SME sector in India, historically, it happened in 2 or 3 different ways. One way in which it happened was that small companies set up to service the needs of large companies. This was typically called an ancillary program. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had a lot of large Indian manufacturing companies being set up, often by the government. And they needed components, they needed some specialized services, they needed other parts and so on, which went into the products they were creating. And they built these ancillary parks where these suppliers would be located and would work with the parent company. Now, what happened over time is, in many cases, the core technology of the parent company went through significant changes. Sometimes the market also went through a significant change, and either there was no need for the particular skill of the SME, or the SME was not able to adapt well to the changing requirements of the parent company. So even though the SME might have started with some specific skills, over time, some of these skills were, I don't know whether eroded is the right word, but at least they became much weaker than they were earlier. Yeah. So this is one strand. The other strand is, historically in India, we had some industries which were reserved for the small scale. It was believed that small is beautiful and certain kind of labor-intensive companies should be allowed to sort of be protected from the competition of large companies. So till somewhere like the early 90s, we had a lot of reservation for small companies. But once the economy was deregulated and these regulatory requirements were removed, these small companies often struggled to remain competitive when confronted either with imports or with large companies in India, which had economies of scale and so on. So this is, in a way, the sort of historical context. In recent times, there have been further challenges. One challenge in India has been that the government has been focusing quite a bit on formalization. So, for example, we have our GST, the new tax regime, which came in a few years ago, which essentially requires small companies to either become part of the GST network or to suffer significant disadvantages. So this has caused a new challenge for SMEs. It's certainly been good for those companies which wanted to scale up, but not so good for those which had very limited kind of advantages. So I think in summary, I would say that the Indian SMEs, many of them do start with some innovation abilities, but often they are not able to sustain them. And there have been policy and other changes which have also had an impact on the way these companies would evolve. Having said that, let me just make one final point at this stage. There are lots of companies which have used technology quite well to grow big. Let me just give you two examples. So today we have one of India's most important players in the biofuel sector. Is a company called Frietsch Industries in Pune. Frietsch started maybe 40 years ago, essentially trying to do something very simple. They were trying to convert sugarcane molasses into alcohol through a fermentation process. They actually did import technology from Europe. I'm not sure from which country. But when they tried to use that technology in India, they found the technology didn't actually work. And the reason it didn't work was because the sugarcane molasses available in India was very dirty. It had a lot of other, impurities and so on. And the very pristine process which came from Europe simply didn't work. So to cut a long story short, Praj had to work a lot to change that process. Along the way, they learned very good process development skills. They became one of the leading suppliers of process technologies for these kind of processes across the world, including in Latin America, North America, and so on. But this was a 25-30-year journey. And then more recently, in the last 10-15 years, they've gone into basic R&D and become a producer of biofuels, using their process capabilities to sort of support what they have, what they're developing in the lab. So this is a good example of a company that did start by technological collaboration with a company in Europe, but you can see the kind of challenges it's had to go through in order to become a significant technology player. And I think the credit really goes to, say, the leadership team of this company, Mr. Pramod Chaudhary and others, who really kept at it for 25-30 years to make this happen. Now, not surprisingly, maybe today's average entrepreneur would not be willing to perhaps look at such a long time horizon. So, but I think the point I would like to close with is by saying that your absorption and adaptation skills are quite important, because often when you borrow technology or when you get into a collaboration agreement, the technology will require a lot of adaptation to work in Indian conditions, with Indian skill levels, with Indian levels of technology in the factory and so on. So unless the small enterprise has these abilities to adapt and absorb, it's unlikely this kind of collaboration will work very well, at least assuming that the technology is coming from the German or European partner. So let me just stop here.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So then that, puts the question, what could be a business model? So if you look at what the German side can bring to the table, clearly you both have said there are engineering skills in Germany. There is this Germany's brand, which says they are world leaders in technology and they can bring a scientific temper. In India, you have SMEs that are facing challenges of, policy changes and other things, but and therefore are not able to make that, leverage their strengths. Given that, do you think we can look at a business model where you say capability from Germany and trying to scale in India and testing it in a very complex market could actually be a value proposition for both countries? I would just leave it to both of you to say, whoever feels addressed on this question.
Maybe if I may start, I think the idea as such is definitely a good one, and I think that there is big potential into that. The challenge is how to handle that and how to really make it bring it on the way. For the German companies, especially the SMEs, I'm not talking, because we're not talking about large companies, because that's completely different. So for small companies, they usually are active in let's say restricted market. They usually stay within their area or within Germany and focus on that, and then they are part of a value chain. So at the end, they will need to be convinced that this can also be transferred to another country. So if you're talking about those who are already exporting, or those who are already at an international level, I would say we should make really this distinction between those who do simply exporting and are selling their products, and those who really do something like knowledge sourcing. And the knowledge sourcing to enhance their own activities or to join forces with others. And there definitely is the potential here. I have no clear idea how to set up this business model that you were talking on, but definitely there is a chance for that. But again, I come back to what I said before. Trust is the basis for that. It might take a while.
Rishi?
Yeah, so I think there are, what I'm sort of getting from this discussion so far is possibly there are multiple business models. One, just to repeat, is the one I mentioned earlier, where you combine the traditional engineering capabilities of German companies with the digital and other technology skills of Indian companies. That seems to be a little more a meeting of equals, because the Germans bring one technological capability, the Indian SMEs bring another one. Hopefully, when you bring this together, you do something that's good for both of them. So that seems to be one model. The second model is the one you just hinted at, which is the more traditional model, which is assuming that the technology flow is happening primarily from Germany to India, where an Indian company is looking to a German partner to enable it to upgrade its technological capabilities and then scale it up and so on. But I would only caution you on one thing. I think scaling up is a completely non-trivial activity. I don't know too much about SMEs in Germany in terms of how good they are at scaling up things, but I would say Indian companies in the small and medium sector are not necessarily very good at scaling up. I just want to tell you another small story. This again is a company which is, I think, is not in the market today, but it is a company which I studied at one point of time. This is a color picture tube manufacturer based in North India. And they were originally making black and white tubes. They didn't have a color picture tube technology. So in the early 80s, when color TV came to India, they reached out to companies outside India. They finally found a source, not from Germany, by the way, but from Japan, from whom they could get the technology. But try as they would for several years, they were simply not able to achieve the kind of yield which the technology source in Japan was able to achieve. So while they were able to produce picture tubes, their rejection rates were very high. And interestingly, whatever technology the Japanese company gave them in terms of drawings, designs, etc., there seemed to be some tacit knowledge involved, which the Indian company was not able to quite get. And as a result, they were never able to really meet the kind of productivity levels the Japanese company could. Finally, how did they solve this problem? They solved this problem again, not locally, by the way. They found another company in Korea, which had been a licensee of the same technology from Japan. And they found that this Korean company had a lot of ex-employees who had retired, who were quite willing to be consultants. They finally came to India and, they shared some of the tacit knowledge they had gained over time. And finally, the Indian company was able to enhance its yield and get much more on par with the original Japanese company. And by the way, at the time all this was happening, this CPT company, the color picture tube company, was quite small. Of course, later it became quite big, but to start with, it was more like an SME that we might be talking about. So this only underlines for me once again the importance of absorption, the importance of even the recipient needs a certain minimum level of technological understanding in order to take the technology from the source and scale it up effectively. So this is the only challenge I see with the model that you mentioned, Anandi, that unless we need perhaps another partner who can help in scaling up. Because traditionally, at least my take is that Indian SMEs have not been very good at scaling things.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I do agree with you, Rishi, because particularly, we need to, one of the challenges or one of the reasons why this has not really taken off the way it should have, the SME collaboration, although for the last 10 years, I have been to enough platforms where this has been discussed, and I'm sure about both of you have, is that we have probably not found a business model that it's a win-win situation for both. It has either been a transfer of technology from Germany to India for the advantage of a German company, or they are just using another partner for a particular small value proposition, which is either market or which is either delivery. But what we need is a comprehensive business model which works. What we're trying to attack here. In that sense, I want to ask you, because you said that you probably need somebody to help them, would an intermediary like a research institution or an RTO like Fraunhofer, can they play a role to bring, or even the DWIH or anybody else for that matter, play a role to bring these partners together in a very, very concrete way, try and match their complementarities and handhold them to the next stage? Would that help? Rainer, you recently did a major study around this. Would you like to take a shot at it?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed. I was also thinking about when you mentioned the business model, how to really set it up and bring it on the way. And for at least the German policy, maybe I start it this way. Over the past 20, 30 years in general, so science and innovation policy, or innovation policy in particular, was focusing on SMEs, because SMEs needed special support, whereas large companies, they are able to handle most of the things by themselves. So, and we have really developed experience with SME policies that work well. On the one hand, for national activities and for enhancing their let's say technological competences, but also in particular for collaboration, for international collaboration. And we have something like what we call 2+2 in Germany, which is a model where usually a German research organization and a German company, or at least one of each, joins forces with and sets up a project with partners in another country, usually also then a company and a research organization. And coming back to what I said before with the trust, usually research organizations, they already have a collaboration, or they can easily trust each other because they work on the same grounds without any let's say competition in that respect. So usually it really works very well. And the other side, and this is what you mentioned before, what we see for Fraunhofer, we did a study, first of all on Germany, but it might work, of course, also in other countries, that if especially SMEs who are not doing research themselves, or not permanently doing research themselves, or cannot dig in so deep into certain topics and tasks, if they collaborate with Fraunhofer, they really benefit from that collaboration. They usually then also order, so to say, these research services at Fraunhofer in the following years, and they have a direct also economic effect of that. So when collaboration between science and industry is at play, then there is always also the chance that there can be not only basic research done, and we've seen that, of course, also in particularly funded public research projects where more, let's say, basic oriented research is done, also with participation of companies. But Fraunhofer's task is to bridge the gap between the basic research and the application, and this is exactly where the companies have a benefit from. So something like a 2+2, so a joint public-private projects on two sides, is definitely an approach that, from my point of view, and also from the experience we have in Germany with these kinds of projects and programs, definitely works.
Mm-hmm. Rishi, you too have done a lot of work on understanding, like you gave us some outstanding anecdotal experiences of how small and medium companies have managed to do it or not managed to do it. Do you have some ideas on what an organization like yours, which is extremely well known in the industry and the research, what kind of an intermediary role can you play to ensure that the SMEs come together, or at least support them in coming together?
That's an interesting question. I'll give you an example from a slightly different context, if you don't mind. So we have an Israel Center in IIM Bangalore. And as part of the activities of the Israel Center, we try to support collaboration between Indian and Israeli companies. So one of the ways we have been trying to do that is to use our students as a kind of intermediary, if you like. So the students undertake projects in Israel where they make a visit to Israel, they interact a lot with Israeli companies, then they try to understand what they are doing. They also then try to locate Indian companies with whom they can create some kind of a match between the Israeli company and the Indian company. Often, of course, this is not necessarily technological collaboration alone. This could also be for addressing the market, or it could be for market access. But we have certainly seen some examples of this kind of a student course where, this kind of thing could happen. So one thing I could sort of envisage is we have a course which is called International Business in Practice, where our students go to different countries. They currently go to about 7 or 8 different countries. I don't think we have a German version of that course right now, but one possibility is we could start that if there is some support available to do that. And we could get our students to be sort of intermediaries or engage or try to look for some opportunities for German and Indian companies to collaborate with each other. So this is just one example which I can think of.
Yeah, I was also thinking of, that's an interesting point, that using students as bridge between, the two countries. And of course, you know that the number of Indian students in Germany has also been increasing substantially. And that is definitely one point that can be considered. But, when you come to technology collaboration, a lot of it is really very confidential. And like Rainer said again and again, there's a lot of trust involved. So if you look at the enabling actors in this, entire scenario, there is a government which could be an enabler, and there is possibly intermediary organizations like the DWIH or the other industry associations who could be an enabler. The government has a particular role to play. It can either fund or it can either create programs that support. But very often we have seen that the funding is for a very limited duration and for a very specific purpose. So if you both were given an opportunity to completely start afresh, and dream big, what would you say the government can do to be an effective enabler and not just somebody who sows a seed and steps back? Could you start with that, Rishi? Because, in India, it is even more difficult than is in Germany, because in Germany, you do have a lot of funds for industry from the government, but India, it is rather limited. So what would you say we should do something about it to improve
Yeah.
this?
So I think there is scope for the government to do some interesting things here. Traditionally, the Indian government has been quite reluctant to make grants to private enterprise. So that has been one of the biggest barriers. So in most of the collaborative programs between industry and academia, the government tends to be willing to fund the academic side or the sort of so-called non-profit side, but they are usually reluctant to fund the industry side directly. However, we have seen some exceptions to that in recent times. For example, we have seen in the biotech space through BIRAC, the government has a pretty extensive funding program, right from startups to large companies, looking at both the development of technology as well as scaling up. So since there are exceptions to the traditional way the government has funded this kind of activity, hopefully we could look at some new ways of funding. We could look at, maybe the government stepping in to help companies, particularly in scaling up or in sourcing technological support from organizations, maybe like Fraunhofer or maybe even other organizations as well. You might like to study some of the government initiatives which are already there. I don't know how well they are working. For example, there is I'm sorry to give an example of Israel again, but there is an India-Israel R&D support program, which is, or in the past has been funded by the government. I don't know how well it works, but it's certainly one model which exists. So you might like to go and look at it. Most of the other technology collaboration agreements or support agreements are in basic science, like the India-French one and so on is more in basic science. But the one I know which also has an application component is the Israel one. So you might like to take a look and see whether there's something we can learn from that.
Yeah, sure. Rainer, what about you? What do you think that government can do more to support SME to SME collaboration in a sustainable manner? I know that from Germany there is something happening regularly, but it is more piecemeal and more very short-lived. What would you think?
Yeah, I mean, looking, let's say, stepping back and having the big picture in mind, I would say we see that public funding is important in some parts, especially when it's either when you want to start a structural change or support a structural change, or if there's really far away from the market any activity where you need to create ground knowledge or basic knowledge. But it's much more relevant for companies, or they are much more committed when they bring in their own money. And this is what the insight for policymaking in Germany over the past years. And what government has been doing is not necessarily directly funding them. Of course, also part, and several of the programs are doing exactly that. But they provide a platform. They provide the basis for that. And even for science-industry linkage, they provide the platform. And this works then in a way that the public side, so that the public research organizations are funded fully with their engagement, and the companies are they have to join in. So for one of the most successful examples of the past is the leading edge cluster competition, where they really set up their own project, and then there is a competition among these projects, and they get funding for not for the research itself. Of course, the research organizations do, but not the companies, but for really collaborating, for exchanging, for developing the ideas further, etc., and then doing things like that. So providing platforms could be an option, definitely, that goes beyond the pure funding.
Right. So, I mean, it is true that, there is support and funding, and Maybe we could look at more sustainable funding. But of course, other than the government, there are organizations in India as well as in Germany, like the KfW or the SIDBI, where we could utilize them more effectively to get credit lines at some very attractive conditions for SMEs to come together, particularly if the government puts this as a policy initiative for technology upgradation and collaboration. We have another 10 to 12 minutes left. I'd like to utilize this time to, first of all, ask you for some suggestions that we, as you know, DWIH and Fraunhofer want to put together a document which says that what should we do in order to enhance this collaboration? What are the deficits that we need to remove so that companies find it easier to come? Can both of you give me 2 or 3 points that come to your mind where you say that this needs to be addressed in order to make it more effective?
Maybe I start with 1 or 2 points, and I always come back to my trust and this line of argumentation. Next to trust, it's of course also knowledge, and there is definitely a cultural difference, and there is a, let's say, a cultural hurdle also that is there that for SMEs needs to be overcome. So information sharing and really explaining things to both sides. So to Germans and to Indian companies and to German and Indian intermediaries, but also research organizations, is definitely a task that should be addressed here, from my point of view. The second thing is indeed start not with the, let's say, the big business model as you described it before. Do it step by step. Otherwise, it will be a challenge that might be too big. And I was wondering, and coming also back to one of the questions in the chat, is there something where this, what I mentioned, this 2+2, or also something like Fraunhofer similar in India, where science-industry linkage is already there, which could be brought in from the Indian side to such an exchange with the German side. So if you could organize that, I think you already get at least one step ahead.
Yeah, true. Rishi, would something come from your side in terms of suggestions for us?
See, I'd like to go back to the point which Rainer made about trust. So one of the questions is, how do you develop trust? And I don't think trust is going to drop from heaven, and it's not going to happen, all of a sudden. So I think if you want to develop trust, you got to start with small interactions first. You have to start with a process where two people work together. They both sort of figure out what each other's capabilities are. They start believing that the other person can deliver on what they say. Once that happens, you slowly start feeling more confident about working with the other. So I think we need to create opportunities for this to happen. Let me give you another example of something which happened in India several years ago, but I think the impact of that continues even today. So there was something called a collaborative automotive research program. This might have been about 10, 15 years ago. The idea was to bring the large automotive sector in India, which was becoming more capable. We have companies like Tata, Mahindra, Bajaj, TVS, all of them trying to develop their own product development and R&D capabilities. To bring these companies together with the academic and research institutions. Both of these had not collaborated much before. So the government encouraged them to come with proposals on ways in which they could collaborate within some broadly defined areas. And very much like Rainer said, what the government said was they would support the expenditure happening in the academic institute or the research institute, but the companies would be expected to bring in their own money to take things forward. And the interesting outcome of all of this was that there were no, I wouldn't say there were any great breakthroughs out of this program itself, but there were lots of spin-offs down the line. I think what happened was some collaborations between some of the companies and these institutions became strong. They continued to talk to each other. Later, they started working on other collaborative projects. Interestingly, a few good startups also came out of this. One of the professors in IIT Bombay, who was working with one of the motorcycle companies, he decided to start his own company to commercialize what he was doing for that motorcycle company. That company is, by the way, doing quite well today. So, and that company became a more long-term collaborator for the motorcycle company. But over that, I guess it was 7-8 year period when the government underwrote some of this collaboration. The outcome of the program itself may not have been anything to write home about, but certainly in the long term, a lot of the networks and links and everything, those trust relationships that got built were very useful to facilitate later collaboration. So I think if I were you, I would think along those lines. I probably wouldn't put overly ambitious outcomes to start with, but maybe just look at some baby steps where you're actually trying to create these broad frameworks for people to collaborate. And I'm sure many good things will come out of that over time.
Yeah, thank you, Rishi. It would be interesting for you to note that the CAR program that you're talking about, which Dr. Chidambaram led, it was in fact one of the big projects that Fraunhofer got involved in. And this was, for the lightweighting of the automotive industry through joining of, metals and plastics, so different forms. So yes, I totally agree with you that such a collaborative research platform could be extremely interesting to build trust, to first come together. Let us take a few questions from the audience. There is a question that is there a possibility for startups, for early stage startups in Germany to get incubation support? I don't know if it is coming from a German person who's asking for it, or is it an Indian company saying, if I'm an early stage startup, can I get incubation support in Germany? But Rainer, since it's about startups in Germany, do you have any idea about incubation support for early stage startups?
I mean, we have definitely a number of funding programs, especially for startups or spin-offs, to be more precise, from public research organizations. So the EXIST is the biggest startup, but this is targeting mainly German research organizations and German startups. Then we have, in Germany, it's often said that we don't have enough venture capital available. But still, there is, of course, venture capital investment in Germany is still there and still massive.
Yeah.
I would say if you want to start a business in Germany, you will find definitely funding for that, but not necessarily from public sources and not necessarily from a German fund.
Yeah, well, it's not very different in India either. So there are very many sources for funding. Professor Krishnan, there's a question for you. Can we affect institutional twins in India in the manner of Fraunhofer that might work with SMEs, especially on technology? I think we do have CSIR institutions which are somewhat similar to Fraunhofer, don't you think?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Anandi, I don't know what is the meaning of this twin thing. Sorry, I didn't get it.
I think the question probably says something similar to. It's not an institutional twin. I think if I may hazard a guess, he's actually talking about something similar to the Fraunhofer and calling it an institutional twin. But what he means that you probably need an institution that works particularly with SMEs on technology.
I think, as Anandi, as you know, well, traditionally, most of our government research labs, have been stronger in the basic research and the apply, and if at all, maybe the early stages of application. Transferring something to industry was traditionally not a strength, but I think we are seeing that changing quite rapidly now, particularly because of the focus of the government on Atmanirbhar Bharat and other programs. Of course, there have been exceptions to what I said. Pharmaceuticals is probably one example where we
Absolutely.
have seen lots of technologies getting transferred to the industry, particularly for processes and process R&D kind of thing. But in general, I think there's a long way to go for Indian research labs to sort of work closely with SMEs. And we don't really have organizations which are that similar to Fraunhofer with its focus on more on the application side. Though there, again, we do have some new institutes. For example, there's a translational Health Research Institute in Faridabad, and there are lots of new, I think, organizations that are coming up looking more at the translation aspect, but we'll have to see how those evolve over time.
Yeah, true. But I do see a lot of action happening in this field. So as many of the audience participants may know, that the Indian government has set up 6 clusters in India, and these clusters are purely looking at translational research, and they've brought in institutions as well as startups as well as industry together so that the technology readiness levels of 5 to 9 on a continuum of 10 can be achieved. It is a new initiative, so we'll have to wait and see how it develops. There is another question that has come from Gautam Kulsi. Because it's a very personal question, I would suggest that we take it up individually with you, Mr. Kulsi. We will try and see if one of us can send you a mail on this, because it's a very personal question. We'll take it offline. I also have a question from Dr. Sanjay Bharadwaj from ARCI Hyderabad. Incidentally, an excellent organization with whom Fraunhofer has also worked very closely. He says Professor Rishikesha mentioned an important point about the role of R&D centers as intermediaries to increase technology absorption for SMEs and startups. The business model should help. And he is suggesting that both speakers should comment on this aspect. I think we have commented on the business model aspect, but if there's anything either of you want to share on this, please feel free.
Yeah, I think what Sanjay is referring to is probably the fact that there are more dynamic kind of ways in which research institutes can get involved. So I know, for example, in ARCI, they have, in 1 or 2 cases, actually taken technologies developed in labs elsewhere in the world and then tried to develop those further and then commercialize them with Indian industry. But ARCI is quite an exception in this regard. It's not a very common model. So I think it will be interesting to see if we can find other examples of that.
I mean, indeed, it's what I referred to before. What Fraunhofer's role in Germany is exactly bridging this gap. And when we're talking about intermediaries, or R&D centers are as intermediaries, really helping to absorb, and then of course, an absorption in this case, from my point of view, means making basic research insights usable for commercialization, for really development of new products or new processes. So bridging this gap, and this is Fraunhofer's role in Germany. Not only Fraunhofer is this task. We have other organizations doing that, but definitely, from my point of view, that's something that intermediaries can do. And we found, as I said before, really an effect for SMEs in that respect, because they usually cannot afford to do such big projects. They usually don't have the capacity, the skills, the competences to really do own R&D processes. So they can rely on let's say, these kind of external R&D services. And here, public research organizations or intermediaries, as suggested here, are definitely an important contributor here.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much we can continue talking and, pick your brains on these topics, but we are just coming close to our closing session. So I'd like to quickly summarize some of the things that we discussed today. We agreed that we should look at similarities rather than differences. And in similarities, very clearly, both the speakers brought out that there are very complementary strengths where India has in deep technology, IT, and Germany has engineering and product design, manufacturing sense. So they can come together very beautifully. India is fast, nimble, flexible. We can manage complexity because we are used to doing that because of the heterogeneous market that we live in. German companies are renowned for discipline and scientific temper. Again, complementary strengths. We talked about the German Mittelstand, which is quite unique. World leaders in niche market, 99% of them are SMEs, but only 30 to 40% of them are really innovative companies looking for partners worldwide. And the opportunity lies in the fact that the R&D in Germany has become more expensive, more complex. So there's an opportunity for collaboration with other countries. The challenges that we talked about, Rainer mentioned again and again, trust, and that the SMEs go for trade secrets rather than IPR. So it's a little difficult to formalize such a relationship based on documents and agreements. So there needs to be the trust so that they're aware that their capabilities are not going to be utilized or misused. There is also a need to explain the advantages of collaboration to the German SMEs and to bring the capabilities of India and the reality of the Indian market to them. So information sharing is much needed, and that is a challenge today, that German SMEs do not have complete information or access to information about opportunities with India. And Rishi talked about the historical context of the SME, which is really one of the challenges, that there is a journey that has taken place, which happened through ancillary programs or, the reservation for small companies where they were penalized for growing. And by the time they wanted to grow, it was a struggle for them. Added to that, new policy changes that they have to grapple with, and their own, ability or lack of ability for absorption, adaptation, and calibration. One of the very important topics that we touched about today is about the business model. How do we, curate a business model that is a win-win alliance? The technology and brand image of Germany marrying the scale and heterogeneity from India, is that one business model? Or are there others that we need to consider? Because that can be the crux of this collaboration. Role of governments was discussed, where we thought of what is the enabling role of government, which is sustainable and long-term. And here we talked about not just funding, but creating a platform. And that is a very valuable discussion here. Suggestions going forward, both speakers talked about trust, knowledge sharing, and the role of intermediaries in bringing together the SMEs from both countries. So I think a lot of food for thought. I'm not sure if I've missed any point. I would request the speakers to please fill it in if I have. But very engaging conversation, excellent anecdotal experiences, which really, put the finer perspective on each point that you discuss. So thrilled to have you on board. And I'd like to each one of you to say the last few words if you have anything more to content. Otherwise, thank you so much in any case for being on board. And I hope that you will stay in touch with us and engage with us further. Rishi and Rainer, if you have anything more to say on this.
So thank you, Anandi. I don't have anything to add, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the excellent summing up.
Exactly. Thank you, Anandi, and really excellent summary and really brought to the point. I think there is indeed now something where we hopefully can exchange also in the future. So I'm happy to get in exchange with several people already contacted me. So I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, that's a great start, Rainer, that people reach out to you, and to all those who have participated in this fireside chat today. Thank you so much for your time and your interest. We will be sharing a presentation by Rainer, which is very interesting and informative to all of you. I'm sure the organizers will do that, and feel free to reach out to us or the speakers. This is just the start of a long journey, and we need every hand on board. Look forward to having you again. And Katya, I hand over to you to close the session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, not much to add. Thanks so much, Anandi, for the excellent moderation and leading us through this diverse and sometimes a bit of difficult topic. Thanks to Professor Frietsch and to Professor Krishnan for the useful insights into the German and Indian system and how one cooperate. I think we got a lot of new food for thought. We will take up the topic together with Fraunhofer. We will drive it forward. We are currently working on a blueprint, which hopefully towards the end of autumn we will have out, where we sum also up the results of this discussion. Thanks to the audience for the questions which were posted here. So what remains for me is to wish you all a nice day for our German participants and a nice evening for our Indian participants. Looking forward to further connect with our speakers, but also with our attendees on the topic. And we will provide all the attendees next week the presentation. And if you maybe missed out a couple of points, we also will provide on our online platform the recording of this session. So thanks again for the wonderful fireside chat we had today. And for me, it remains all to you to have a nice evening or a nice day ahead.
Thank you.
Katya.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.